Alright, this is a lesson video covering the basics of thesis statements. You're going to be using thesis statements in this class all the time. Every time you write something, I'm going to ask you to have a thesis statement. Some of you may be familiar with thesis statements, others of you may be a little less comfortable. Basically, a thesis statement is where you clearly communicate in one or two sentences the main idea of what you're trying to persuade your audience of. You come out and say, this is what I want to get across to you. This is what I want to prove to you. Thesis statements are like the keys to your car. If you don't have keys, you're not taking that vehicle anywhere. If you don't have a thesis statement, your argument, your writing is not going anywhere. If you've ever found yourself in the middle of an essay not knowing what to write next, that's because you didn't have a good thesis statement. A good thesis statement lets you and your audience know exactly what it is you're trying to say. So, we need to go over some things about these thesis statements. Basically, there's a couple of things that all thesis statements should be. They should be debatable. They should take a clear position on the prompt, not be wishy-washy. And all thesis statements should be as specific as possible. Now, on a side note, every time I see a thesis statement, I know you're going to be tempted to use the phrase I think, I believe, and in my opinion. Well, I'm going to ask you to do not do that. You're going to be really tempted to use one of those phrases to start it off, but every time you do it, I'm going to ask you to cross it out. Here's why. When you use one of those phrases, it actually makes you sound very unsure, and it makes whatever point you're trying to make seem very weak. And in the kind of writing we're doing, you have to sound sure and you have to sound strong. So do not use those phrases to start your thesis statement. Let's look at what it means to have a debatable thesis. When students write a thesis statement, a lot of time, the first time they go after it, they write something that's not really even up for debate. They write something obvious and safe. For instance, this statement is not debatable. Pollution is bad for the environment. You don't say. The reason this is not debatable is because everyone knows that pollution's not a good thing for the environment. No one thinks it's a good thing to take a bucket full of trash and dump it in a state park. That's not debatable. Now, there is a controversy on how much of a problem pollution is. Some people think it's a huge problem. Some people don't think it's a really big problem at all. But as far as pollution being bad, well, we all basically agree on that. So, what does a debatable thesis look like? Let's take the same idea about pollution and let's find where we can make it a debate. At least 25% of the federal budget should be spent on limiting pollution. Now, while we all agree that pollution's a bad thing, I think we would find a lot of people that disagree on whether or not we should take a fourth of our federal budget, a fourth of the money our government has, and spend that on limiting pollution. I think a lot of people would think that that's way too much money to spend on that. This is debatable. You also need to take a clear position in your thesis. Because most of you are very nice people and you're very open minded and you kind of want to see all sides, that's a very healthy way to be. But being that way in a thesis statement, not really having a clear position, is actually makes for very weak writing. So here's an example of an unclear position in a thesis. Some people think the environment is polluted and others disagree. There's no clear position taken. This person's trying to be in the middle on the issue, and it just makes for a statement that's not really saying anything. It's just kind of covering all sides. That does not make for a strong thesis statement. On the other hand, here's an example of a clear thesis position. America's anti pollution efforts should focus on switching to electric vehicles. There's no doubt of what this person is trying to convince us of. What they did is made a very specific claim and have a very clear position. They're going to tell us how and why we should focus to switching to electric vehicles. Aha. Finally, thesis statements need to be specific. You need to get into the details. Here's an example of a non specific thesis statement: drug use is bad for society. When I see this thesis, I know it's not specific because what kind of drug use are we talking about? We all take medication, those are technically drugs. Are we saying that those kind of drugs are bad for society? Or are we talking about illegal drug use? It says it's bad for society. Well, what society? Which society? Where? Who is it bad for? Why is it bad for them? This thesis just is not specific enough. It leaves too much up in the air. So here's an example of a specific thesis statement: illegal drug use is detrimental to society because it encourages gang violence. Now we see a specific kind of drug use. And we see, what is it to society? It's detrimental. This is negative on society. And why is it negative? Well, because of one specific thing. We're not trying to say every reason why illegal drug use is bad, but we're saying one specific thing. That is, it encourages gang violence. That is a specific thesis statement. If I was reading this essay or writing this essay, I would have no doubt of the point I am trying to prove. And all I would need to worry about is providing evidence to support that idea. That's what we're going for with thesis statements.